My husband's first wife showed up at our dinner party and everything I thought I knew about him was a complete lie. I'm still shaking as I write this. It's been 3 days since our dinner party and I haven't slept more than a few hours total. My entire marriage feels like it's been built on a foundation I never knew was crumbling underneath me. I'm 31, been married to my husband James for 3 years, together for 5. We live in Austin, Texas. I'm a marketing manager at a tech company. He's a financial consultant. We met at a networking event in 2019, started dating seriously about a month later, got engaged after 18 months, married 6 months after that. Everything felt natural and right and easy in a way my previous relationships never had. James is 38, 7 years older than me. He's thoughtful and steady and reliable. The kind of person who remembers to pick up your favorite coffee on the way home and actually listens when you talk about your day. He's close with his family, has a solid group of friends from college, coaches youth soccer on weekends. He's exactly the kind of man I'd always hoped to marry. He told me early on that he'd been married before, briefly, in his late 20s. He said it had been a mistake. They'd gotten married too young, realized they weren't compatible, divorced amicably after less than 2 years, no kids, clean break, they'd both moved on. He said her name was Caroline and that they hadn't been in touch since the divorce was finalized in 2015. I appreciated his honesty about it. A lot of people hide previous marriages or get weird and defensive when discussing them. James was matter of fact. It happened. It didn't work out. He learned from it and moved forward. I respected that. In 5 years together, he's never given me a reason to doubt him. He's never been secretive about his phone or computer. He doesn't have mysterious absences or unexplained charges on credit cards. He's just consistently present and honest. And exactly who he appears to be, or at least that's what I believed until Saturday night. We were hosting a dinner party, nothing fancy, just 8 people including us, 2 couples from my work, 1 couple who are James's college friends, and his business partner Derek with Derek's girlfriend. We do these dinners every few months, rotate who hosts. Everyone brings wine and dessert. I'd spent the afternoon cooking, made a nice brisket, roasted vegetables, salad, the whole thing. James was helping me set up the dining room when the first guests arrived around 7. By 7:30 everyone was there except Derek and his girlfriend. We opened wine. People were chatting in the living room. Everything was relaxed and normal. I was in the kitchen checking on the brisket when the doorbell rang again. James went to answer it. I heard him open the door and then just complete silence. Not a greeting, not conversation, nothing. Just silence for long enough that I noticed it from the kitchen. I walked toward the front door to see what was going on. James was standing in the doorway completely frozen. Standing on our porch was a woman I'd never seen before. She was maybe late 30s, dark hair, professional looking in slacks and a blazer, pretty in a severe kind of way. She was staring at James with this expression I couldn't quite read, shock maybe, anger, something intense. James finally spoke. His voice sounded strange, tight. He said Caroline, the woman, Caroline, his first wife Caroline, said hello James. It's been a while. I stood there trying to process what was happening. James's ex-wife, who he claimed he hadn't spoken to in 9 years, was standing on our porch during our dinner party. James just kept staring at her like he'd seen a ghost. He didn't invite her in, didn't explain why she was there, didn't introduce me, just stood there. I finally stepped forward and introduced myself, said I was James's wife, asked if there was something we could help her with. Caroline looked at me for the first time. She had these sharp green eyes that seemed to take in everything about me in about 3 seconds. Then she said she needed to speak with James, that it was urgent, that she was sorry for showing up unannounced, but she didn't have any other way to reach him. Our guests had started gathering in the hallway behind me, curious about what was going on. The whole situation was surreal and uncomfortable. James finally seemed to snap out of whatever trance he'd been in. He said this wasn't a good time. We had guests. Caroline needed to call him tomorrow and they could meet somewhere to talk. Caroline said no. She said she'd tried to find him for months and now that she finally had, she wasn't leaving until they talked. Her voice was calm but there was steel underneath it. One of my coworkers, Sarah, tried to lighten the mood by offering Caroline a glass of wine. Caroline ignored her completely, just kept staring at James. I was getting angry now. This woman had shown up at our home, was causing a scene in front of our friends, and James was just standing there looking pale and scared instead of handling the situation. I told Caroline she needed to leave, that if she wanted to speak with James she could call him during business hours like a normal person, that showing up at our home uninvited was inappropriate. Caroline finally looked at me again. She said, I'm sorry, you seem nice, but you have no idea what's actually going on here. Then she looked back at James and said, I know about Ethan. James went even paler. He actually swayed a little like he might pass out. I had no idea who Ethan was. James had never mentioned anyone named Ethan. Caroline continued. She said, I know you've been using a different name. I know you moved to Texas. I know you've built a whole new life. But Ethan is 12 years old now and he deserves to know his father. The hallway went completely silent. Everyone was staring at James. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. Ethan, 12 years old, his father. James had a child, a 12-year-old child he'd never mentioned, a child with his first wife who he'd claimed he had no kids with and no contact with. I heard myself ask who Ethan was. My voice sounded strange and distant. Caroline said Ethan is my son, our son, James's son, the son he abandoned when he left Seattle 12 years ago without telling anyone where he was going. James finally spoke. He said that wasn't fair. It wasn't that simple. Caroline knew why he'd left. Caroline's composure cracked. She said simple. You disappeared. You changed your name. You stopped paying child support. You made it impossible for me to find you. I've been raising our son alone for 12 years while you were what? Pretending you never had a family. Our guests had started quietly gathering their things. Sarah whispered that they were going to go. Give us privacy. Within 5 minutes everyone had left except Caroline still standing on our porch. I invited her inside because I needed answers and apparently she was the only person who was going to give them to me. James looked like he wanted to protest but he didn't say anything. We moved to the living room. I sat on the couch. Caroline sat in the armchair. James stood near the window looking like he might throw up. I asked Caroline to explain from the beginning, everything. She took a breath and started talking. She and James had met in Seattle in 2008. She was finishing her MBA. He was working at an investment firm. They dated for a year, got married in 2009, she got pregnant in 2010, Ethan was born in January 2011, James had seemed happy during her pregnancy, excited about becoming a father, but after Ethan was born, something changed. He became distant, anxious, started working longer hours. He'd had these episodes where he'd seem panicked for no reason. Caroline thought it was normal new parent stress, but it got worse. James started talking about needing to leave Seattle. He said he felt trapped, that he needed a fresh start. Caroline suggested therapy. James refused. In August 2012, when Ethan was 18 months old, James left for work one morning and never came home. He didn't answer his phone, didn't respond to messages, just vanished. Caroline filed a missing persons report. The police investigated but found no evidence of foul play. James's car was found at the airport. His credit cards hadn't been used. He'd withdrawn $15,000 in cash from their joint account the day before he disappeared. The police eventually concluded he'd left voluntarily. Caroline was left alone with a toddler, a mortgage, and no idea where her husband had gone or why. She tried everything to find him, hired a private investigator, searched social media, contacted his family and friends. No one knew where he was. His parents claimed they hadn't heard from him either. Eventually she had to accept he was gone. She filed for divorce in absentia in 2014. It was finalized in 2015. She got full custody of Ethan by default since James couldn't be located to contest it. She struggled financially for years. James had been the primary earner. She had to sell their house, move in with her parents, go back to work while managing childcare for a toddler. It was devastating. The hardest part was explaining to Ethan as he got older why his father wasn't around. She'd told him that his dad had left when he was a baby and she didn't know where he was. Ethan had grown up with this absence, this hole where his father should have been. Then 6 months ago, Caroline had gotten a message from a woman on Facebook. The woman said she'd been doing genealogy research and had found a connection between her family tree and Caroline's. She included a link to a DNA match on one of those ancestry websites. The match was to someone named Ethan Chen, Caroline's son. The DNA match showed this person shared 25% of Ethan's DNA, making them likely a half-sibling. Caroline had investigated, found out the match belonged to a man named James Morrison in Austin, Texas. James Morrison had apparently taken a DNA test a few months earlier. She'd looked up James Morrison, found his LinkedIn profile with a professional photo. It was James, her James, using his middle name Morrison instead of his last name Chen, living in Austin, working as a financial consultant, married to someone named Claire, married to me. Caroline said she'd tried to contact him through LinkedIn but he never responded. She'd tried calling his workplace but couldn't get through to him directly, so she'd hired a private investigator to find our home address, and tonight she'd shown up because she was out of options and her son deserved to know his father. I sat there listening to all of this in complete shock. The man I'd married, who I thought I knew completely, had an entirely different life he'd never told me about, a wife he'd abandoned, a child he'd walked away from, a name he'd changed to hide from his past. I looked at James. He was still standing by the window, tears running down his face. I asked him if it was true. All of it. He nodded. I asked him why. Why would he abandon his family? Why would he lie to me about all of it? He finally spoke. His voice was shaking. He said he'd been diagnosed with severe anxiety and panic disorder right after Ethan was born. He'd had a complete breakdown. He'd become convinced he was a terrible father, that he was going to ruin his son's life, that his family would be Better off without him. He said he'd been having panic attacks multiple times a day, couldn't sleep, couldn't function. He'd felt trapped and desperate and irrational. One day he'd woken up convinced the only solution was to leave, to remove himself from their lives completely so he couldn't damage them anymore. He'd withdrawn cash, driven to the airport, bought a ticket to Dallas, and just started over. He'd changed his name legally to James Morrison, his middle name and his mother's maiden name. He'd started seeing a therapist in Dallas, got on medication, slowly got his mental health under control. He'd built a new life from nothing. He said he'd known it was wrong. He'd known he was hurting Caroline and Ethan, but the shame and guilt had made it impossible to go back. The longer he stayed away, the harder it became to imagine returning. Eventually it seemed easier to just pretend that life had never happened. When he'd met me, he'd told himself he deserved a second chance, that he was a different person now, stable and healthy. He'd convinced himself the past didn't matter because he'd changed. He said taking the DNA test had been a stupid impulse. A coworker had been talking about discovering Irish heritage and James had thought it would be interesting. He'd never considered that Ethan might have also taken a DNA test or that it could lead Caroline to him. He kept saying he was sorry, over and over. Sorry to Caroline, sorry to me, sorry to Ethan. I felt numb. This man I'd built a life with was a complete stranger. Everything he'd told me about his past was a lie. He wasn't divorced from someone he'd grown apart from. He was a man who'd abandoned his wife and infant son and run away to start a new life under a fake name. Caroline was crying now too. She said she'd spent 12 years believing James might be dead, that not knowing had been torture. Finding out he'd been alive this whole time, living a normal life while she struggled alone, was almost worse. She said Ethan had started asking more questions about his father in the past year. He'd wanted to know why his dad didn't want him. Caroline hadn't known what to tell him. Now she knew. His father hadn't died or disappeared mysteriously. He'd just chosen to leave and never come back. I asked Caroline what she wanted, why she'd come here. She said she wanted James to meet Ethan. Her son deserved to know his father existed and was alive. She didn't expect James to suddenly become an active parent, but Ethan needed closure. He needed to understand he wasn't abandoned because of something wrong with him. She also said James owed her 12 years of child support. She'd raised Ethan alone with no financial help. James had been legally obligated to support his son and he'd avoided that obligation by disappearing. James said he'd pay whatever he owed. He'd meet Ethan if that's what Caroline thought was best. He'd do whatever they needed. I asked Caroline if she'd known about me, if she'd known James was married again. She said yes. She'd found my social media when she was researching James. She'd seen our wedding photos. She said she felt bad for me, that I clearly had no idea who I'd married. She was right. I had no idea. Caroline left around midnight. She gave James her number and said to call her within the week to arrange a meeting with Ethan. She said if he didn't call, she'd be pursuing legal action for back child support and making sure everyone in his current life knew exactly who he really was. After she left, James tried to talk to me, tried to explain and apologize and beg for forgiveness. I told him to sleep in the guest room. I needed time to process and I couldn't look at him. He left the room and I sat on the couch until sunrise trying to make sense of everything. Update: 3 days later. I'd barely spoken to James since Saturday night. We're living in the same house but existing in completely separate realities. He's been sleeping in the guest room. I've been going through the motions at work, coming home, avoiding him. I told my best friend Maya everything on Sunday. She came over, brought wine, let me cry and rage for hours. She said I needed to talk to a lawyer before making any decisions. That James's actions had legal implications and I needed to protect myself. I met with a divorce attorney Monday morning, found one who does free consultations, explained the whole situation. The attorney said that in Texas, if James had lied about previous marriages or children, that could potentially be grounds for annulment rather than divorce. She also said that if Caroline pursued James for back child support, which she was absolutely entitled to do, it could impact our shared finances. She recommended I separate my finances from James immediately. Open my own bank account, move my paychecks there, protect my assets in case Caroline came after him legally. I did that Monday afternoon, opened a new account at a different bank, changed my direct deposit, transferred half of our joint savings to the new account. James noticed but didn't say anything. I also started going through all of James's documents in his home office. I needed to know what else he'd lied about. If there were other secrets buried in our marriage. I found his legal name. Changed documents from 2013. James Chan officially changed to James Morrison in Dallas. I found old tax returns under his original name, found photos from his first wedding I'd never seen, found a birth certificate for Ethan Chan born January 2011 in Seattle. He'd kept all of it, hidden in a filing cabinet in his office, evidence of the entire life he'd pretended never existed. I also found bank statements showing he'd been sending monthly payments to an account in Seattle for the past 2 years. $500 every month like clockwork. When I confronted him about it Tuesday night, he broke down, said he'd felt so guilty after we got married that he'd started sending Caroline money anonymously. He'd found her address through public records and sent cash in unmarked envelopes every month. He thought it would help assuage his guilt. I asked if Caroline knew the money was from him. He said he didn't think so. He'd never included a note or return address, so he'd been secretly sending his first wife money while lying to me about his entire past. The deception just kept getting deeper. James has been begging me to go to therapy with him, to let him explain everything fully, to give him a chance to make this right. I don't know what making it right would even look like. He abandoned his child. He lied to me for 5 years. He built our entire relationship on a foundation of deception. How do you come back from that? I called my parents Tuesday night and told them everything. My dad was furious, wanted to come to Austin immediately and confront James himself. My mom was heartbroken, kept saying she thought James was such a good man. They both said I should leave him, that no one who could abandon their own child and lie about it for years deserves a second chance, that I deserve better than someone who's been deceiving me since the day we met. Part of me agrees with them, the rational part that knows this is unforgivable, but there's another part of me that keeps thinking about the James I've known for 5 years, the man who's been nothing but kind and supportive and present, the man who remembered my mother's birthday and helped my brother move and coached kids soccer. Was all of that fake? Was he just playing a role this whole time, or is it possible for someone to have genuinely changed, to have been a completely different person 12 years ago and become someone better? I don't know. I don't trust my own judgment anymore. I married someone I didn't really know. How can I trust myself to evaluate whether he's actually changed or just gotten better at lying? James called Caroline on Wednesday, like she'd asked. They talked for over an hour. I don't know what was said, but afterward James told me Caroline wants him to meet Ethan next weekend. She's flying him down to Austin so they can meet on neutral territory. James asked if I'd be there when it happened. I said absolutely not. This was his mess to deal with. He started crying, said he understood why I hated him, but he needed me to know that everything about our relationship was real. He'd lied about his past, but his feelings for me were genuine. He loved me. He wanted to save our marriage. I told him I didn't know if there was a marriage to save. Everything I thought we had was built on lies. I didn't know who he really was anymore. He said he'd prove to me he'd changed. He'd do whatever it took. I said the only thing he needed to do right now was meet his son and start trying to repair the damage he'd caused 12 years ago. Anything between us could wait until he dealt with that. Maya thinks I'm crazy for even considering staying. She says the lying is unforgivable, that I should leave immediately before I waste any more time on him. My therapist, who I started seeing on Tuesday, says I need to separate James's past actions from his current actions, that people can change and grow, but that I need to evaluate whether the person he is now is someone I can trust and build a life with. She says there's no rush to make a decision. I don't know what to do. Part of me wants to pack a bag and leave and never look back. Part of me wants to understand how this happened and whether there's any possibility of rebuilding. Mostly I just feel betrayed and confused and angry. The man I married isn't who I thought he was. I don't know if I can ever trust him again. I don't know if I want to try. But I also keep thinking about Caroline and Ethan, this 12-year-old boy who's about to meet the father who abandoned him, the woman who raised a child alone while the father built a new life and pretended they didn't exist. James didn't just lie to me. He destroyed an entire family and then ran away from the consequences. How do you forgive something like that? As then he said meeting Ethan was the hardest thing he'd ever done, seeing the damage he'd caused reflected in his son's eyes, knowing he'd given this kid abandonment issues and trust issues that would probably last a lifetime. He said he understood now that running away hadn't protected his family from him like he'd convinced himself. It had just hurt them in a different way, a worse way. I asked him what he was going to do now. He said he was going to pay Caroline every penny he owed her. He was going to email Ethan every week whether Ethan responded or not. He was going to spend the rest of his life trying to make up for what he'd done, knowing he probably never could. Then he asked me what I was going to do. I told him I didn't know, that I needed more time. He nodded, said he'd give me whatever time I needed, that he'd move out if I wanted, that he'd do whatever I asked. I told him to stay in the guest room for now, that I wasn't ready to make any permanent decisions. That was yesterday. Today I've been sitting with everything trying to figure out what I want. Here's what I know. James did an unforgivable thing. He abandoned his wife and infant son. He ran away from his responsibilities. He lied about it for years, including lying to me for our entire relationship. Those facts don't change regardless of his mental health issues or his remorse or how much he's supposedly changed. But I also know that the James I've experienced for 5 years has been kind, reliable, and present, he's been a good partner to me. He's been involved in his community, mentored young people through soccer, been generous with his time and money. Are those things negated by what he did 12 years ago? Or can both things be true? Can someone who did something terrible also have genuinely become a better person? I don't know the answer. My therapist asked me what I need from James to even consider staying. What would have to be true for me to rebuild trust? I thought about it for a long time. Here's what I came up with. First, complete honesty from this point forward. No more secrets, no more lies, no more hiding parts of his past. If we're going to move forward, it has to be with everything on the table. Second, he has to genuinely repair his relationship with Caroline and Ethan as much as possible. He has to pay the child support he owes. He has to show up consistently for Ethan even if Ethan doesn't want a relationship. He has to prove through actions that he's taking responsibility. Third, couples therapy, intensive, long-term, with someone who specializes in betrayal and trust issues. We'd need to rebuild our relationship from the ground up. Fourth, time. I need time to process this and figure out if I can actually forgive him. No pressure, no timeline, no expectations. If James can do all of that, maybe there's a possibility of saving this marriage. Maybe. But I'm not sure yet if that's what I want, if it's worth the effort. I keep coming back to what Maya said, that I deserve someone I can trust completely, that I'm only 31 and I don't have to stay with someone who's lied to me for years just because we're married. She's not wrong. But I also keep thinking about marriage vows. For better or worse, this is definitely worse. But does that mean I should automatically give up? Or does it mean I should try to work through it? I don't know. What I do know is that I need to talk to Caroline. I need to hear her perspective on all of this. She lived through James's abandonment in a way I never did. She knows who he really was back then. I messaged her through Facebook yesterday, introduced myself properly, said I knew this was strange but I'd like to talk to her if she was willing, about James, about what happened, about everything. She responded this morning, said she'd be willing to talk. She's flying back to Seattle this afternoon but we could video chat later this week if I wanted. I said yes, I need to understand the full picture of who James was and what he did before I can decide if the person he's become is someone I can stay married to. Update 3, Caroline's story. I talked to Caroline last night over video chat for almost 3 hours. It was one of the most intense conversations I've ever had. She was generous with her time and surprisingly not angry at me. I'd been worried she might resent me as the woman who got the stable, present version of James while she got the version that abandoned her. But she said she didn't blame me for any of it. I was just another person James had lied to. I asked her to tell me about their marriage, the real story, not the sanitized version James had given me. She said they'd met in 2008 at a professional networking event in Seattle. James had been charming and attentive. He'd pursued her actively, seemed genuinely interested in building a life together. They'd had common values, similar goals. It had felt right. They'd gotten married in 2009 after about a year of dating. Caroline said the wedding had been beautiful. Their families had been happy. Everything seemed perfect. The first year of marriage was good. They'd bought a small house in a Seattle suburb. Both had jobs they liked. They'd talked about starting a family and decided to start trying after their first anniversary. Caroline got pregnant in early 2010. She said James had seemed excited. He'd gone to all the doctor's appointments, helped set up the nursery, read parenting books. He'd been involved and present. But she said there were signs she'd missed. James had always been anxious, but during her pregnancy it got worse. He'd have periods where he seemed distant or distracted. He'd started seeing a therapist but hadn't talked to Caroline much about what they discussed. Caroline had assumed it was normal stress about becoming a father. She'd been nervous too. She thought they'd figure it out together once the baby arrived. Ethan was born in January 2011, healthy, no complications. Caroline said those first few weeks were exhausting but happy. James had taken paternity leave, helped with night feedings, seemed like he was adjusting, but around the time Ethan turned 2 months old, something shifted. James started pulling away. He'd volunteer to work late. He'd zone out when Caroline talked to him. He'd hold Ethan but seemed mechanical about it, like he was going through motions. Caroline had tried to talk to him about it. James had said he was fine, just tired, adjusting to the new normal, but she could tell something was wrong. The anxiety attacks started when Ethan was about 4 months old. James would wake up in the middle of the night hyperventilating. He'd have episodes where he couldn't breathe, where he'd say his chest felt tight and he thought he was dying. Caroline had convinced him to see a doctor. He'd been diagnosed with panic disorder and given medication. The doctor had recommended intensive therapy. James had agreed to go but Caroline said he'd never fully engaged with treatment. Instead, he'd started withdrawing more. He'd work 12-hour days. He'd sleep in the guest room saying he didn't want to wake Caroline and the baby. He'd find excuses to be out of the house. Caroline had tried everything. She'd suggested couples counseling. She'd offered to take on more of the childcare so James could focus on his mental health. She'd asked his family to help. Nothing worked. James had started talking about moving. He'd say Seattle was too gray, too depressing. He'd bring up other cities where they could start over. Caroline had said they couldn't just uproot their lives with a new baby. She'd said he needed to work through whatever he was dealing with instead of running from it. Then one morning in August 2012, James had gotten dressed for work like normal. He'd kissed Caroline goodbye. He'd looked at Ethan sleeping in his crib for a long moment. Then he'd left, and he'd never come back. Caroline said the first few hours she'd thought maybe he was working late. Then she'd gotten worried and called his office. They said he'd never come. In that day, she'd called his cell phone over and over. No answer. She'd called his parents, his friends. No one had heard from him. By midnight she'd filed a missing persons report. The police had found his car at the airport the next day. Security footage showed him buying a one-way ticket to Dallas with cash. The detective told Caroline it looked like James had left voluntarily. There was no evidence of foul play or coercion. He'd planned it, withdrawn cash from their account, and left. Caroline said that realization was devastating. James hadn't been kidnapped or hurt. He'd chosen to leave, chosen to abandon their baby and disappear without explanation. She'd spent months trying to find him. She'd maxed out credit cards hiring a private investigator. She'd searched every database she could access. She'd called every James Chin in Dallas and then every James Chin in Texas. Nothing. Meanwhile she was drowning. She'd had to return to work when Ethan was 4 months old because they needed the income. James's paychecks had stopped. The mortgage was due. She'd had to move in with her parents because she couldn't afford the house alone. Her parents had helped with childcare but they were elderly and it was hard on them. Caroline was working full-time, caring for an infant, and trying to process the fact that her husband had vanished. The worst part, she said, was the not knowing if he was alive or dead, not knowing if he'd left because of something she'd done, not knowing if he'd ever loved her and Ethan at all. She'd eventually filed for divorce in absentia, had gotten full custody of Ethan by default, had sold the house to pay off debt, had rebuilt her life piece by piece. Ethan had started asking about his father around age 4. Caroline had told him the truth in age-appropriate ways, that his daddy had left when he was a baby and she didn't know where he was, that it wasn't Ethan's fault, that sometimes adults made choices that hurt people. And there wasn't a good reason for it. As Ethan got older, the questions got harder. He'd wanted to know why his dad didn't want him, whether his dad ever thought about him, whether they'd ever see each other again. Caroline had never had good answers. She'd dated occasionally over the years but nothing serious. She'd focused on Ethan and her career. She'd built a good life. But there'd always been this shadow over it, this absence that couldn't be explained. Then finding out through the DNA match that James was alive, that he'd been living in Texas the whole time, that he'd changed his name and built an entire new life complete with a new wife. Caroline said that had broken something open in her that she'd kept closed for years. The anger was overwhelming. He'd let her believe he might be dead. He'd let their son grow up without a father. He'd avoided every responsibility while she'd struggled alone. And he'd done it all while apparently being perfectly capable of holding down a job and maintaining a relationship. He'd done it because he'd wanted to, not because he couldn't function. That was what hurt the most, she said, that he'd clearly been capable of being a stable partner and showing up consistently. He'd just chosen to do those things for someone else instead of for her and Ethan. I listened to all of this feeling sicker and sicker. Hearing it from Caroline's perspective made it so much worse than how James had described it. James had made it sound like a mental health crisis he couldn't control, like he'd been so sick he hadn't been able to see another option. But Caroline's version made it clear he'd made choices. He'd planned his departure. He'd withdrawn money. He'd bought a plane ticket. He'd decided to leave and never contact them again. That wasn't a crisis. That was a calculated abandonment. I asked Caroline what she thought about James now, after seeing him again, after watching him meet Ethan. She said she thought he was genuinely remorseful, that the guilt was real, but that remorse didn't undo 12 years of damage. She said she'd probably never forgive him, but she was trying to let go of the anger for Ethan's sake. Ethan deserved the chance to have some kind of relationship with his father if he wanted one, even if it was complicated. She said she felt sorry for me, that I seemed like a good person who'd been caught up in James's mess through no fault of my own, that I deserved to know the truth about who I'd married. I asked her what she thought I should do, stay or leave. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said she couldn't tell me what to do, that it was my life and my choice. But she said if it were her, knowing what she knew now, she didn't think she could trust someone who was capable of that level of deception, that someone who could lie about their entire past for years would be capable of lying about anything. She said the James I'd known for 5 years might be genuine, but he'd also proven he was capable of completely reinventing himself and hiding fundamental truths. How would I ever know for certain that he was being honest? I didn't have an answer for that. We talked for a while longer about logistics. Caroline said her lawyer was drawing up the child support agreement and James's lawyer had agreed to the terms. She said James had offered to pay the full amount immediately but she'd insisted on a payment plan. She wanted it to be a long-term commitment so he'd have to think about what he'd done every single month for the next several years. I Thought that was fair. She also said Ethan had agreed to exchange emails with James. He wasn't ready for regular calls or visits yet, but he was willing to communicate in writing. Caroline thought it was a good start. Before we hung up, Caroline said something that's been stuck in my head since. She said that James had told her he'd left because he was afraid he'd ruin Ethan's life, but by leaving, he'd guaranteed he would. Ethan had grown up with abandonment issues, with questions about his worth, with a father-sized hole in his life. If James had stayed and worked through his mental health issues, even if he'd been imperfect, Ethan would have been better off. She said running from your problems doesn't protect the people you love, it just hurts them in a different way. She was right. And that's what I keep coming back to when I think about my marriage. James ran from his problems 12 years ago. What's to say he won't do it again? What's to say if things get hard in our marriage, he won't decide the solution is to disappear again? How can I build a life with someone who's proven they're capable of that? Update 4. My decision. I asked James to move out yesterday, not permanently necessarily, but I needed space to think without him in the house. He'd been expecting it. He packed a bag and went to stay with Derek, his business partner. He didn't argue or try to convince me otherwise, just said he understood and he'd give me whatever space I needed. Before he left, I gave him a list of things I needed him to do while we were separated. First, continue therapy individually. He needs to work through why he made the choices he made 12 years ago and why he thought lying to me was acceptable. Second, follow through on every commitment he'd made to Caroline and Ethan. Pay the child support. Email Ethan consistently. Be available if Ethan wants to talk or meet again. Third, give me complete access to everything. Finances, phone records, emails, all of it. If we're going to consider rebuilding, there can't be any more secrets. Fourth, no pressure on me to make a decision quickly. This separation is indefinite. I'll let him know when I'm ready to talk about next steps. He agreed to all of it, wrote it down so he wouldn't forget, promised he'd do everything I asked. After he left, I sat in our house alone for the first time since this all started. It felt empty but also calmer, like I could finally breathe without the weight of his presence and his guilt and his need for forgiveness. I've spent the last 24 hours really thinking about what I want. Here's what I keep coming back 2. I don't know if I can forgive James for lying to me, not just about being married before, which would have been forgivable, but about having a child, about abandoning his family, about changing his name to hide from his past. Those aren't small lies. Those are fundamental deceptions about who he is as a person. And the thing is, he didn't just lie once and then feel guilty and confess. He lied consistently for 5 years. He lied when we were dating. He lied when we got engaged. He lied when we got married. He lied every single day we were together. Every time I asked about his first marriage and he gave me the sanitized version, that was a choice. Every time we talked about maybe having kids someday and he didn't mention he already had a son, that was a choice. He chose to deceive me over and over again. I keep trying to separate the James the first knew from the James who abandoned his family, trying to believe they're different people, but they're not. They're the same person. The capacity to do what he did 12 years ago exists in the same person who's been my husband, and I don't know if I can live with that knowledge. My therapist asked me if I still love him, if underneath all the betrayal and anger, there's still love there. I said yes. I still love the man I thought he was. I love the James who brought me coffee in the morning and made me laugh and supported my career. I love the James who coached kids soccer and helped my brother move and remembered my mom's birthday, but I don't know if that James is real, or if it's just another version of himself he created. As carefully constructed as James Morrison was, how do I know the person he's been with me is authentic when he's proven he's so skilled at becoming whoever he needs to be? I don't. That's the problem. I can't know. He says he loves me. He says everything about our relationship was real, but he also said he loved Caroline and then he abandoned her and their baby without a word. His words don't mean anything when his actions have shown he's capable of such complete betrayal. I talked to my parents again yesterday. My dad still thinks I should leave immediately, that someone who could do what James did doesn't deserve another chance. My mom is more sympathetic. She says people can change, that mental illness is real, that maybe James genuinely is different now. But even my mom admits that the lying to me specifically, the building of our entire relationship on deception, is really hard to overlook. Maya is firmly in the leave him camp. She says I'm 31, no kids, financially stable. I can walk away from this and build a new life with someone who doesn't have this kind of history, someone I can actually trust. She's not wrong, but there's a part of me that feels like walking away is the easy choice, that marriage is supposed to be for better or worse, and this is definitely worse. But maybe that means I should try to work through it. Then I think about what Caroline said, about how she could never trust someone again who'd proven capable of that level of deception, about how she'd always wonder if he was lying about other things, and I realize I'd be the same way, even if James and I stayed together, even if we did therapy and he did everything right, I'd always have this doubt, this knowledge that he's capable of maintaining a complete lie for years. Every time he was late from work, I'd wonder. Every time he was on his phone, I'd wonder. Every time he seemed distant or stressed, I'd wonder if he was planning to disappear again. That's no way to live. That's not a marriage. That's constant surveillance and suspicion masquerading as a relationship. I deserve better than that. Even if James has genuinely changed, even if he never lies to me again, I don't know if I can get past what he's already done. And maybe that's okay. Maybe some things are unforgivable not because the person can't change, but because the damage to trust is too severe to repair. I don't think I've completely decided yet. Part of me still wants to believe we can work through this. Part of me still loves him and wants to save our marriage, but a bigger part of me knows that leaving is probably the right choice, the healthy choice, the choice that respects myself enough to say that I deserve a partner I can trust completely. I have a mediation appointment scheduled with a divorce attorney next week. Not to file yet necessarily, but to understand my options. What divorce would look like financially, legally, practically. I also told James's parents everything. They deserved to know. They'd been lied to as well. James had told them he wasn't in contact with Caroline and Ethan. That his first marriage had ended cleanly with no complications. They were devastated. His mother cried. His father was angry. They said they'd raised him better than that they were ashamed of what he'd done. But they also said they still loved him and hoped he'd make things right with Ethan. They asked about me, about our marriage. I told them honestly that I didn't know if we'd stay together. James's mother said she'd understand if I left. That what he'd done was unforgivable, but she also said she'd seen him with me over the years and believed he genuinely loved me, that he'd become a better person, even if he'd built that better person on a foundation of lies. I don't know if that matters. Love isn't enough if you can't trust the person. I'm supposed to meet with James this weekend. He asked if we could talk face to face, said there were things he wanted to explain in person. I agreed because I owe it to the 5 years we spent together to at least hear him out, but I don't think anything he says will change the fundamental problem, which is that he lied to me about who he was for our entire relationship, and I don't know if I can forgive that. Final update. Moving forward, I met with James yesterday at a coffee shop halfway between his temporary place and our house, neutral territory. He looked terrible, like he hadn't been sleeping. He'd lost weight in the 2 weeks since he'd moved out. Part of me felt bad for him. Most of me felt numb. We sat down and he immediately started apologizing, said he'd been thinking constantly about everything he'd put me through, about how unfair it was that I'd been dragged into his mess, about how much he wished he'd been honest from the beginning. I let him talk. He went through the whole history again, trying to explain his mindset 12 years ago, the panic, the fear, the irrational conviction that his family would be better off without him, the shame that had made it impossible to go back, the way the lie had grown over time until it felt impossible to tell the truth. He said meeting Ethan had broken something open in him, seeing the damage he'd caused face to face, realizing that all his justifications about protecting his family by leaving had been delusional. He'd hurt them worse by leaving than he ever could have by staying and working through his problems. He said he understood now that mental illness explained his actions but didn't excuse them, that he'd made choices, and those choices had consequences, and he had to live with that. Then he said he knew he didn't deserve forgiveness, not from Caroline, not from Ethan, and not from me, but he wanted me to know that everything about our relationship had been real. His love for me was genuine. The life we'd built together wasn't a lie even if the foundation had cracks he'd hidden. He said if I wanted to leave, he'd understand. He'd sign whatever papers I needed, split our assets fairly, make it as easy as possible. He wouldn't fight me, but if there was any part of me that wanted to try to rebuild, he'd spend the rest of his life proving he'd changed. He'd be completely transparent. He'd go to therapy as long as I needed. He'd do whatever it took. I listened to all of it. Then I told him my decision. I said I believed he loved me. I believed he genuinely tried to be a good husband within the confines of the lies he was telling. I believed he regretted what he'd done and wanted to make it right. But I also said I couldn't stay married to him, not because I didn't love him, but because I couldn't trust him. The foundation of our relationship was built on deception, and I didn't think we could rebuild from that. Every time I looked at him, I'd see someone who was capable of abandoning his child and lying about it for years. Every time he was stressed or struggling, I'd wonder if he was planning to run again. Every time he told me something about his past, I'd question whether it was true. That's no way to live, and it's not fair to either of us. I told him I thought he should continue building a relationship with Ethan, that he should pay Caroline what he owed her, that he should keep working on himself in therapy, that maybe someday he'd be able to forgive himself, even if the people he'd hurt couldn't. But I couldn't be part of that journey with him. I needed to move forward with my own life. James cried, didn't try to argue or convince me otherwise, just said he understood and he was sorry for wasting 5 years of my life. I told him they weren't wasted, that I'd learned things about myself and what I needed in a relationship, that I'd had good times I didn't regret, even if the ending was painful, but I also said I deserved a partner I could trust completely, someone whose past I actually knew, someone who wouldn't hide fundamental parts of themselves from me. He agreed, said I deserved that and so much more. We talked logistics after that, the house, our finances, how we'd separate everything. James said he wanted me to keep the house if I wanted it, that he'd buy out my half of the equity or we could sell and split it, whatever I preferred. I said I'd probably sell. Too many memories in that house now, too much of James woven into every room. We agreed to use a mediator for the divorce instead of fighting it out with lawyers. James said he'd sign whatever I wanted. He wasn't going to make this harder than it already was. Before we left, James asked if we could stay in touch, not immediately, but eventually, once I'd had time to heal. He said he valued our friendship even if the marriage was over. I said maybe, that I couldn't promise anything right now, that I needed space and time to process everything. He nodded, said he'd wait as long as it took, that he'd always care about me regardless of whether we ever spoke. Again, we hugged goodbye. It felt final in a way that made my chest ache. This was really over. The life I'd built with him, the future I'd imagined, all of it was ending. I cried the whole drive home, but underneath the sadness, there was also relief. I'd made a decision. I wasn't trapped in limbo anymore, agonizing over whether to stay or go. I was moving forward, even if the path ahead was unclear. That was 3 days ago. I've started the process of filing for divorce, found a good mediator who specializes in amicable separations. James and I have our first mediation session next week to start dividing assets and finalizing everything. I've also started looking at apartments. Can't afford to buy another house on my own right away, but I found a nice 2-bedroom in a complex near work. Put in an application yesterday. Should hear back by Friday. Work has been a welcome distraction. I threw myself into a major campaign launch and it's kept me busy enough that I don't spiral into thinking about everything constantly. My friends and family have been incredible. Maya has been over almost every night, bringing takeout and wine and letting me process everything out loud. My parents have called every day just to check in. Even my coworkers, who only know the basic outline of what happened, have been supportive. I told James's parents about the divorce. They were sad but understanding. His mother said she'd always care about me and hoped we could stay in touch. I said maybe, but probably not for a while. It would be too hard. I've been thinking a lot about Caroline and Ethan, about how Caroline rebuilt her life after James left, how she managed to raise Ethan alone and create a good life despite everything. If she could do it after being abandoned with an infant, I can do it after a divorce with no kids and a stable career. I actually messaged Caroline a few days ago, thanked her for being willing to talk to me, for sharing her story, told her I was getting divorced and that our conversation had helped me make that decision. She wrote back saying she was sorry it had come to that, but that she thought I was making the right choice, that I was young enough to start over and find someone who deserved me, that she hoped I'd take time to heal and be kind to myself through the process. She also said Ethan had been emailing with James, nothing deep, just superficial updates about school and soccer, but it was something, a start. I'm glad for that. Ethan deserves to have his father in his life in whatever capacity feels right to him, even if James failed him catastrophically for 12 years. I also heard from James's lawyer about the child support agreement. James had decided to pay the full $180,000 immediately rather than over time. He'd liquidated some investments and drained most of his savings to do it. Part of me wondered if that was a gesture meant to impress me, to show he was taking responsibility, but honestly, I think it was more for him than anyone else. He needed to feel like he was doing something meaningful to make amends. Even though money can't undo abandoning your child, Caroline confirmed she'd received the payment, said she was putting most of it in a college fund for Ethan. The rest would go toward paying off debt she'd accumulated during the years she raised him alone. She deserved every penny and more. I've been doing a lot of therapy, twice a week now instead of just once, working through the betrayal, the grief over losing the marriage I thought I had, the anger at being lied to for so long. My therapist keeps reminding me that it's okay to feel multiple things at once, to be angry at James for lying but also sad about losing the relationship, to know leaving was the right choice but still grieve what I'm walking away from. She's right. I do feel all of those things simultaneously. Some days the anger is strongest. Some days it's just sadness. Some days I feel nothing at all, just numb, but I haven't regretted my decision. Every time I think about staying, about trying to work through it, I imagine living with that constant doubt, always wondering if he's being honest, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. I can't live like that. I won't. I deserve a relationship built on truth and trust, not one where I have to verify everything my partner tells me because he's proven capable of sustained deception. Maya asked me the other day if I thought I'd ever be able to trust anyone again after this, if James's betrayal would make me suspicious of future partners. I said I didn't know, maybe for a while, But I also think there's a difference between healthy caution and letting someone else's actions ruin your ability to connect with people. James lied to me. That says something about James, not about everyone. I can't let his choices prevent me from building healthy relationships. In the future, that would just be letting him damage me even more than he already has. So I'm going to take time, going to focus on myself, my career, my friendships, going to heal and process and figure out who I am outside of this marriage. And eventually, when I'm ready, I want to try dating again, but slowly, carefully, with better boundaries and more questions up front about people's pasts. I'll never make the mistake again of taking someone's word at face value when they tell me about previous relationships. Next time I'll verify. I'll ask harder questions. I'll trust my instincts if something feels off. This experience has taught me that people are capable of extraordinary deception when they're motivated enough, that someone can seem completely trustworthy while hiding massive secrets, that you can think you know someone and be completely wrong. I'd wonder if he was planning to run again. Every time he told me something about his past, I'd question whether it was true. That's no way to live, and it's not fair to either of us. I told him I thought he should continue building a relationship with Ethan, that he should pay Caroline what he owed her, that he should keep working on himself in therapy, that maybe someday he'd be able to forgive himself, even if the people he'd hurt couldn't. But I couldn't be part of that journey with him. I needed to move forward with my own life. James cried, didn't try to argue or convince me otherwise, just said he understood and he was sorry for wasting 5 years of my life. I told him they weren't wasted, that I'd learned things about myself and what I needed in a relationship, that I'd had good times I didn't regret, even if the ending was painful. But I also said I deserved a partner I could trust completely, someone whose past I actually knew, someone who wouldn't hide fundamental parts of themselves from me. He agreed, said I deserved that and so much more. We talked logistics after that, the house, our finances, how we'd separate everything. James said he wanted me to keep the house if I wanted it, that he'd buy out my half of the equity or we could sell and split it, whatever I preferred. I said I'd probably sell. Too many memories in that house now, too much of James woven into every room. We agreed to use a mediator for the divorce instead of fighting it out with lawyers. James said he'd sign whatever I wanted. He wasn't going to make this harder than it already was. Before we left, James asked if we could stay in touch, not immediately, but eventually, once I'd had time to heal. He said he valued our friendship even if the marriage was over. I said maybe, that I couldn't promise anything right now, that I needed space and time to process everything. He nodded, said he'd wait as long as it took, that he'd always care about me regardless of whether we ever spoke. Again, we hugged goodbye. It felt final in a way that made my chest ache. This was really over. The life I'd built with him, the future I'd imagined, all of it was ending. I cried the whole drive home, but underneath the sadness, there was also relief. I'd made a decision. I wasn't trapped in limbo anymore, agonizing over whether to stay or go. I was moving forward, even if the path ahead was unclear. That was 3 days ago. I've started the process of filing for divorce, found a good mediator who specializes in amicable separations, James, and I have our first mediation session next week to start dividing assets and finalizing everything. I've also started looking at apartments. Can't afford to buy another house on my own right away, but I found a nice 2-bedroom in a complex near work. Put in an application yesterday, should hear back by Friday. Work has been a welcome distraction. I threw myself into a major campaign launch and it's kept me busy enough that I don't spiral into thinking about everything constantly. My friends and family have been incredible. Maya has been over almost every night, bringing takeout and wine and letting me process everything out loud. My parents have called every day just to check in. Even my coworkers, who only know the basic outline of what happened, have been supportive. I told James's parents about the divorce. They were sad but understanding. His mother said she'd always care about me and hoped we could stay in touch. I said maybe, but probably not for a while. It would be too hard. I've been thinking a lot about Caroline and Ethan, about how Caroline rebuilt her life after James left, how she managed to raise Ethan alone and create a good life despite everything. If she could do it after being abandoned with an infant, I can do it after a divorce with no kids and a stable career. I actually messaged Caroline a few days ago, thanked her for being willing to talk to me, for sharing her story, told her I was getting divorced and that our conversation had helped me make that decision. She wrote back saying she was sorry it had come to that, but that she thought I was making the right choice, that I was young enough to start over and find someone who deserved me, that she hoped I'd take time to heal and be kind to myself through the process. She also said Ethan had been emailing with James, nothing deep, just superficial updates about school and soccer, but it was something, a start. I'm glad for that. Ethan deserves to have his father in his life in whatever capacity feels right to him, even if James failed him catastrophically for 12 years. I also heard from James's lawyer about the child support agreement. James had decided to pay the full $180,000 immediately rather than over time. He'd liquidated some investments and drained most of his savings to do it. Part of me wondered if that was a gesture meant to impress me, to show he was taking responsibility, but honestly, I think it was more for him than anyone else. He needed to feel like he was doing something meaningful to make amends. Even though money can't undo abandoning your child, Caroline confirmed she'd received the payment, said she was putting most of it in a college fund for Ethan. The rest would go toward paying off debt she'd accumulated during the years she raised him alone. She deserved every penny and more. I've been doing a lot of therapy, twice a week now instead of just once, working through the betrayal, the grief over losing the marriage I thought I had, the anger at being lied to for so long. My therapist keeps reminding me that it's okay to feel multiple things at once, to be angry at James for lying but also sad about losing the relationship, to know leaving was the right choice but still grieve what I'm walking away from. She's right. I do feel all of those things simultaneously. Some days the anger is strongest. Some days it's just sadness. Some days I feel nothing at all, just numb, but I haven't regretted my decision. Every time I think about staying, about trying to work through it, I imagine living with that constant doubt, always wondering if he's being honest, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. I can't live like that. I won't. I deserve a relationship built on truth and trust, not one where I have to verify everything my partner tells me because he's proven capable of sustained deception. Maya asked me the other day if I thought I'd ever be able to trust anyone again after this, if James's betrayal would make me suspicious of future partners. I said I didn't know, maybe for a while, but I also think there's a difference between healthy caution and letting someone else's actions ruin your ability to connect with people. James lied to me. That says something about James, not about everyone. I can't let his choices prevent me from building healthy relationships. In the future, that would just be letting him damage me even more than he already has. So I'm going to take time, going to focus on myself, my career, my friendships, going to heal and process and figure out who I am outside of this marriage. And eventually, when I'm ready, I want to try dating again, but slowly, carefully, with better boundaries and more questions up front about people's pasts. I'll never make the mistake again of taking someone's word at face value when they tell me about previous relationships. Next time I'll verify. I'll ask harder questions. I'll trust my instincts if something feels off. This experience has taught me that people are capable of extraordinary deception when they're motivated enough, that someone can seem completely trustworthy while hiding massive secrets, that you can think you know someone and be completely wrong. It's a hard lesson, but it's one I needed to learn. I just wish it hadn't cost me my marriage to learn it. A few people have asked me if I think James is genuinely remorseful or if he's just upset he got caught. Honestly, I think it's both. I think he's genuinely horrified by the damage he caused. I think meeting Ethan and seeing the consequences of his abandonment face to face was devastating for him. I think his guilt is real, but I also think if Caroline hadn't found him, he would have continued living his life in Austin, married to me, pretending his past didn't exist. He wouldn't have voluntarily confessed. He wouldn't have sought out Ethan. He would have kept the lie going indefinitely. So yes, I think his remorse is genuine, but it's remorse triggered by being caught, not remorse that would have led him to come clean on his own. And that matters. If he'd told me the truth at any point in our 5 years together, if he'd said, I need to tell you something difficult about my past, maybe we could have worked through it. The lie itself might have been forgivable if he'd been the one to confess it, but he didn't. He let me marry him under false pretenses. He let me build a life with him based on incomplete information. That's a choice, and it's a choice I can't forgive. People have also asked if I think James will do the same thing to someone else in the future. Build a relationship on lies, hide fundamental truths. I don't know. I hope not. I hope this has been enough of a wake-up call that he'll be honest with any future partners about his past. But I also know that someone who is capable of sustaining a lie for 5 years with me, after having already abandoned a previous family, has patterns of behavior that are deeply ingrained. Change is possible, but it's hard, and it requires genuine commitment and ongoing work. I hope James does that work. For Ethan's sake more than anyone's, Ethan deserves a father who shows up and tells the truth and takes responsibility for his actions. Whether James can actually be that person remains to be seen, but it's not my job to wait around and find out. I've given enough of my life to someone who wasn't honest with me about who they were. It's time to move forward. I signed the lease on my new apartment yesterday. Move-in date is October 1st, just over 3 weeks from now. It's a fresh start in a place that has no memories of James attached to it. The house goes on the market next week. Our realtor thinks it'll sell quickly given the market and the neighborhood. James and I will split the proceeds 50-50 after paying off a mortgage. I've started going through our shared belongings, figuring out what's mine, what's his, what we need to divide. It's surreal sorting through 5 years of accumulated stuff, wedding gifts from people who thought we'd make it, furniture we picked out together, photos from trips that feel like they happened to different people. I'm keeping some things. The coffee maker because I use it every day and he never figured out how to work it properly. The good knives because I'm the one who cooks. The bookshelf my dad built because it's from my family, not ours. James can have most of the furniture. I want to start Fresh, buy new things that don't have memories attached. I did find our wedding album while packing, sat on the floor of our bedroom looking through photos at us looking so happy and in love. James's vows about honoring and cherishing me, my vows about being partners through whatever life brought us. Neither of us could have known then that whatever life brought us would include his first wife showing up to reveal he'd been lying about his entire past. I put the album in a box for James. I don't want it. Don't want the reminder of promises that turned out to be built on deception. Maybe someday I'll be able to look back on our wedding and remember the good parts, the joy that was real even if the foundation wasn't. But right now it just hurts. Maya helped me pack last weekend. We went through the kitchen, sorted everything into boxes labeled mine, his, or donate. She kept making jokes to keep things light, but I could tell she was sad for me. At one point she asked if I ever imagined this is how it would end, packing up my marriage at 31 because my husband had a secret family. I said no. I'd imagined us growing old together, having kids maybe, building a life. She said I'd still have all those things, just with someone else, someone better. I hope she's right. James and I have barely communicated since our meeting at the coffee shop, just logistical texts about the house and the divorce mediation. He's been staying with Derek, giving me space like I asked. Derek actually reached out to me yesterday, said he'd known James for 15 years and never had any idea about Caroline and Ethan, that he felt betrayed too, though obviously not on the same level I did. He said James had been a mess the past few weeks, barely eating, not sleeping, showing up to work looking hollow. Derek was worried about him but also angry on my behalf. I appreciated him telling me, but I also made it clear that James's well-being wasn't my responsibility anymore, that he had a therapist and he needed to rely on that professional help, not expect me to take care of him while I was processing my own trauma from his lies. Derek understood, said he'd look out for James but wouldn't pressure me to do anything I wasn't comfortable with. Good. I've started thinking about what comes next for me beyond just logistics and practicalities, what I actually want my life to look like moving forward. I think I want to travel. I've been so focused on building a stable life and career that I haven't taken real time off in years. Maybe I'll take a few weeks after the divorce is final and go somewhere I've always wanted to see, Portugal maybe, or New Zealand. I want to invest more in my friendships. I realized through all this that I'd let some of my closest relationships slide because I was so focused on my marriage. I want to rebuild those connections. I want to focus on my career in a new way. Maybe pursue that promotion I've been considering. Take on more challenging projects, build something I'm proud of that has nothing to do with my personal life, and eventually, when I'm ready, I want to try dating again, but slowly, carefully, with better boundaries and more questions up front about people's pasts. I'll never make the mistake again of taking someone's word at face value when they tell me about previous relationships. Next time I'll verify. I'll ask harder questions. I'll trust my instincts if something feels off. This experience has taught me that people are capable of extraordinary deception when they're motivated enough, that someone can seem completely trustworthy while hiding massive secrets, that you can think you know someone and be completely wrong. It's a hard lesson, but it's one I needed to learn. I just wish it hadn't cost me my marriage to learn it. The divorce should be final by early November, just 6 weeks away from officially ending this chapter of my life. Sometimes I can't believe this is my reality. 6 months ago I was happily married, planning our anniversary trip, thinking about maybe starting to try for kids in a year or two. Now I'm 31, getting divorced, living alone, and starting over from scratch. It's not what I wanted, but it's where I am, and I'm slowly coming to terms with that. I know I made the right choice leaving. No, I couldn't have stayed married to someone capable of that level of sustained deception. I know I deserve better, but knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally are different things. Some days I'm angry, furious at James for lying, furious at myself for not seeing it, furious at the whole situation. Some days I'm just sad, grieving the future I thought I'd have, the life I was building that turned out to be built on sand. Some days I'm okay, focused on the future, excited about possibilities, ready to move forward. I'm trying to be patient with myself through all of it, to let myself feel whatever comes up without judgment, to trust that eventually the good days will outnumber the bad ones. My therapist says I'm doing remarkably well given everything, that I'm processing in healthy ways, making good decisions, not falling into destructive patterns. I'm trying. That's all any of us can do, right? Try our best with the information we have, make choices that align with our values, move forward even when it's hard. James destroyed my trust. He lied to me for years. He built our marriage on a foundation of deception, but he doesn't get to destroy my future too. That's still mine to build, and I'm going to build something good, something real, something honest, even if it takes time, even if it's hard, even if I'm starting from scratch at 31, I'm going to be okay. Better than okay eventually. I'm going to be happy again, just not with him.